I'm so happy to be here and so honored to be able to speak to you all. I'm enjoying my time in India so far, and like pretty much everyone else, or most of the other keynoters, it's my first time in India. I'm enjoying the heck out of it. This is a really great conference. I'm so glad to be here. I work at Big Nerd Ranch, and I help build web and mobile applications there. And I live in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. I love the open source community, and I primarily hack on the RSpec project. For this closing talk, I want to reflect a little bit on open source and Ruby. And I know Aaron earlier talked about open source, but I want to take a little different look at it. And I want to talk about also some practical ways that you can get started in contributing to open source. Also, I am going to talk about your company. I want to start off by telling you a story about a web application I helped build. We built a small application for a financial planning firm in Atlanta. They're a small, reputable firm that helps folks plan for retirement. For instance, how much do you need to save in order to not have to work in your older years? So they gather data on your assets, on your liabilities, incomes, learn about your lifestyle, and put together a financial plan to figure out what you need to do in order to retire. And they create a report, and it has some charts in it, and you take it home and you make sure that you're meeting your financial goals. So they had an application already, and does anyone want to guess what tool set they were using to generate these reports? Excel. Also, what else? Yeah, you nailed it. Visual Basic Macros, and there were a lot of them. And I don't know, who here has written a Visual Basic Macro in Excel? Were they pretty small or were they pretty big? Somewhere in between. Well, these were massive. And in some ways, it was actually pretty awesome that they got this all to work together. And I'm not even being sarcastic there. Excel is a really common tool in their industry, and they got it to work. And that's pretty awesome. But they were outgrowing it. The code was kind of a mess. It had been hacked on by many people, and it was really hard to add any new features. And it was actually really slow as well. So we decided that a web application would be a good fit for them. They could access it anywhere. We would make sure it was backed up completely. We did the calculations on the server side, and that's what we built. And it was a Rails application. It was actually a really good fit for Rails. It was CRUD, create, retrieve, update, and delete, for quite a bit of data like assets and liabilities. We had some financial calculations, and we had reporting. And they really liked the finished product. It was successful. They're using it in their business now, and it's working great for them. Here's some excerpts from an email I got from the client after we shipped version 1. As you can tell, he's a pretty awesome client to work with. And the second quote there is my favorite. I don't know if he actually had a kidney stone. I think he did. I'm not sure that Excel caused it, but maybe it did. And he told me he loved his job again. And he might have been overblowing it a bit, but it felt really good to ship something that went over so well. But really, I actually didn't come to you today to just brag about a successful web application that we created. I really didn't. What I actually came here to talk to you about was what it took to build it. So assuming this is a relatively well-built Rails application with maybe about 30 active record models, throw out some numbers. How many lines of Ruby code in the app itself, including unit and acceptance tests? We got 5,000. Anybody else? 1,000? Anybody else? One more guess. Oh, come on now. You're not asleep yet. Come on, one more number. Okay. I ran this tool called Clock on my Rails app, and it came back and told me I had about 7,200 lines of Ruby code in the Rails app itself. And there's actually a significant amount of HTML and JavaScript in this app as well, but I want to focus on Ruby. Okay, so the 5,000 person was close. So about 7,000 lines of Ruby and Rails back-end code is now powering a big part of this client's business now. Except I'm leaving out all of the gems that I used, all of the third-party libraries. I ran this command, and it told me, look for all the gems in the gem file and count them, and there were 42 of them. And about 25 of those I actually loaded in production. The others were for test or development or the asset pipeline. So What if I run this command, bundle install, and download all of the gems to my vendor bundle directory, and then run clock on that directory? What are we talking? That's all of the gems and all their dependencies. How many lines of Ruby? 32,000, 1,000K, 100,000, 200K, 650,000, plus a healthy dose of 100,000 lines of C and C extensions, over 10,000 files. I was really wowed by this. I thought I used a lot of open source, but I had no idea that this Rails application that I made that had 7,000 lines of my code had 90 times more third-party open source libraries that I used. Gems are 98% of my application. And we know that lines of code aren't necessarily the best measure of cost or complexity, but that gap is way too huge to discount. So the code I wrote for the application is not trivial, the code I wrote. But I brought in a lot of other free code that I downloaded from Ruby Gems. And it helped me, it made my life a lot easier, and I was able to ship that application much sooner. So I asked myself, how should that make me feel, that my application is 90% other people's code? My initial reaction was to be humbled, actually. And I think that's an okay emotion to have. I think it's certainly a valuable skill as a developer to take open source, write some code of your own, put it all together in a nice way, and ship something that's usable. But it doesn't change the fact that most of the time, when I write Ruby code, I'm building on top of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of other people's code. It's not just me or my team. The second thing I thought is maybe I should be anxious about this. As businesses, should it concern us that a huge chunk of the value that we provide arrives to us via open source? Maybe not. In fact, a lot of people suggest that it's a good idea to build a business around open source. But also, maybe it's a little anxiety-ridden. Let's explore that a bit. Consider some recent discussion I saw on Twitter. I see the smile. Steve Klavnick says, I do open source primarily to build a commons, but I think, Ruby World especially, is a lot of take and no give. Okay, so this kicked off a lot of discussion, actually. Ryan Big responded and said, I agree with Steve that open source software is way more take than give. It's unfixable. That's painting a pretty pessimistic view. We build our applications on a huge amount of open source. What would happen if those folks got disillusioned and just walked away? I think one of the most public disillusionments in Ruby came from Zed Shaw. And if you know about Zed Shaw and have kind of preconceived notions, just put them aside for a second and focus on what he has to say here. For some background, Zed Shaw created Mongrel, which is a web application server, and it was wildly successful many years ago. Yet he felt like companies didn't appreciate it. He felt like they took it, made tons of money on it, and failed to really realize the impact his software that he built was having, that he gave away for free. He actually goes on to say that if your goal is to make a ton of money quickly, it actually does make sense for you to just take a bunch of open source software, ship it as soon as possible, ship your app as soon as possible, take all the credit for it, and try to get bought out. And while this talk is not about whether that's a healthy way to do business or not, I do want to think about the impact that this kind of thinking might have on open source software. Because I think there's a real, genuine concern about whether some important open source work in Ruby is sustainable. Here's a recent blog post by Mike Perrin. He asks, does open source have a sustainability problem? What percentage of open source projects are ghost towns after 1 year? Many Ruby applications, I think, become difficult to work with as some gems race forward with progress. I'm thinking like Rails. While others stagnate when their maintainers move on or stop contributing. I think there's special concern for Bundler and Ruby gems, where there's relatively few folks maintaining these really incredibly important pieces of our Ruby infrastructure. Now, granted, it's totally within a maintainer's right to walk away from an open source project. They come with no warranty. If he or she is no longer interested in it or otherwise just can't contribute. Yet, if there isn't anyone else to pick up the reins, this should concern us if we want to build applications that last longer than a year or two. I actually was interested enough to try to put some numbers to this and see if I could answer some of those questions that Mike Perrin asked. And so I attempted to do so, and you can tell me if these are valid or not, but here's some food for thought. Here's how I generated them. The GitHub public timeline data has been saved since March 2012. There's actually some data before this, but it's not as rich. So when you push to a repository, a public one, or fork a repository, or open a pull request, or any number of other things, it's all logged and made available in GitHub's timeline data. And you can actually go to githubarchive.org and just download daily tarred up JSON blobs of timeline data. But it's also loaded into Google's BigQuery. A Googler has a setup to just dump this, I think daily, into BigQuery. And with BigQuery, you get a subset of SQL or SQL, but it's run over just on Google scale kind of machines, and it's backed by Bigtable. And you can do some amazing queries over a lot of data. And it's actually really fun to play with. So actually, I encourage you to go play around with BigQuery if you'd like. You get like 100 gigs for free of processed data until they start wanting some money from you. So here's some data. There are about 22,500 Ruby repositories created and pushed to on GitHub in a 3-month period in 2012, excluding forks, so between April and June of 2012. By 30 days later, only 46% of them still had commits being pushed to them. Only 11% after 300 days. Now, I think there's some obvious noise in this data. Some folks push like old university coursework up that they never intend to change, or they create a repository and then end up deleting it. But there's a huge gap we can't ignore, that there's a high probability that a Ruby repository created today will stagnate very quickly, and certainly after a year. There's also some evidence in the GitHub timeline data that we depend on a relatively few number of committers for the most activity on GitHub in Ruby. So of the email addresses that make up commits, the top 10% of commits, the top 10% of people that with the most commits accounted for 62% of the total number of commits. Now, this data isn't perfect either. Some folks switch email addresses or accidentally commit under a different email address, though I tried to mitigate that a bit by not considering any email address with less than 4 commits total. And I also removed some obvious bots that commit to repositories autonomously. But that said, that's weighted really heavily toward the top. Here's a graph of the number of commits to Ruby repositories each month since April 2012, which is the first month of full data. I wish we had a bit more data before April to see what the trend looked like before that. But it's pretty clear that we've dropped off significantly since last year. This year's April and May had about half the number of Ruby commits as April and May of the previous year. So I also don't think this data conclusively proves that we're less productive. It could be that our tools are maturing and we're solving problems that don't generate nearly as many number of commits. But a 50% commits year over year is a quite precipitous drop. So I ask, are we doomed? Is this going to all collapse at some point? Are we going to stagnate? Okay, so actually a spoiler. I'm pretty optimistic about this, and let me tell you why. I think that while some folks knowingly exploit open source without any intention of giving back, and there's actually not a whole lot we can do about those folks, there are all sorts of non-malicious reasons why Ruby has a lot of takers and less givers. I think not the least of which is busyness. We're all building exciting applications for our companies or for personal projects, or we have the opportunity to at least. And there are a lot of things to build, and we want to build them quickly. We talk a lot about shipping in the Ruby community. Shipping code, always be shipping. Shipping is good, and you should definitely be shipping. But I think we need to consider that we're only shipping this fast because open source got us like 98% of the way there. There's this thing called the tragedy of the commons. Here's how Wikipedia defines it. The depletion of a shared resource by individuals acting independently and rationally according to each's own self-interest, despite their understanding that depleting the common resource is contrary to the group's long-term best interests. Here, I think the resource we're talking about is effort spent fostering open source software. We act rationally when we relentlessly ship, even exploiting open source to do so without giving back. But it's also contrary to our best long-term interest. not tending to open source will slow our ability to build things in the future or even maintain the things we've built today. I think there's a better way, and there are examples of folks that both ship and contribute to open source. And though there are many of these, I want to highlight a few to make a specific point. So bear with me here. Cloud City Development responded to a tweet I showed you earlier from Steve. They're committing to support Andre Arco in maintaining Bundler, for instance, one of those hugely important projects. Plataforma Tech has many contributors to Rails. Jose Valim, Carlos Antonio, Rafael France, and maybe others. And they've created and continue to maintain popular projects like Simpleform and Devise. Dockyard is a relatively small consultancy from what I can tell, about 10 people. But they've put out some really useful things for Rails and Ember and released them as open source. I've personally used their client-side validation gem, and there's a gem that will move some of those things that Aaron showed from the Postgres adapter back to Rails 3. So things like Hstore and Array. Tilda, this is Yehuda Katz's company, and Leah Silber and Tom Dale and others. I heard an interesting interview with them on a podcast recently. Yehuda and the others were kind of a bit tired of companies getting bought out and spreading people to the winds after the buyout. And he wanted to build a sustainable company using consulting to fund products, and then the products are built on open source software that they contribute to or spearhead, like Ember and jQuery and Rails. Thoughtbot doesn't do client work on Fridays, and a lot of that effort goes into open source. They also extract cross-cutting concerns in their client applications into frameworks and gems. And we often know that the best frameworks are those that are extracted rather than built up front. Rails is an example of this. So I encourage you, if you're a consultancy or even a product company, make sure your contracts and culture allow you to extract code and put it back into open source. And even if you don't work for a company that can afford a full-time Rails developer or a full-time open source developer, small contributions over a whole team can make a huge impact. It'll help others, and you get the benefit of others looking at your code and maybe even improving it, and that makes it better for everyone. Here's some more data from the GitHub Timeline. This is the most active organizations by number of Ruby commits since the data began. And this data is not perfect either. Many companies contribute to open source outside of an organization, or some of these organizations are not companies, but give it a look. The number one there is actually AlphaGov, which is the UK government, or UK government building a new portal for their kind of access to all government data. And they're building most of it, or maybe all of it, as open source. And so I think no matter what you think of government, I think it's great if they're spending our tax money. It should be done in the open. And so actually that's the number one Ruby organization on GitHub. So scrolling down a bit, there's Cloud Foundry. That's pivotal. It's their platform as a service. A lot of that is open source, maybe all of it as well, actually. Spree, I think a lot of people, who here uses Spree? I've heard a lot of conversation about Spree. Yeah, so Spree is number 5 there. A lot of activity, huge amount of activity on GitHub. Ryan Big works for Spree at this point. Puppet Labs and Opscode are up there. Infrastructure automation, most of their products are open source. OpenShift and Catello are from Red Hat, a sponsor and a huge contributor to open source in Ruby and beyond. Rapid7, does anyone know who Rapid7? Yeah, so Metasploit. Who went to the Metasploit talk yesterday? A few folks? Yeah, so that's the organization that maintains Metasploit. And at least at some point, they claim to be the biggest Ruby code base in one project. I'm not sure if that's still true. But. And Thoughtbot, number 11 there. I think they're the top contributor who's also a Rails consultancy. So kudos to them. And then GitHub is up there at number 18. So this isn't a race to be number one necessarily. All these companies and all these organizations are doing great work. And it's great to see. So here's my point. Here's the point I'm making. You can be a successful business, even a successful small business, and contribute significantly to open source. It's being done. And even if you're not running a business yourself, I think you should want to work for a company that values open source. And not only just giving you time personally to give back, but part of whose core competency is extracting open source and contributing significantly back to the open source software that their applications depend on. Because that kind of company truly understands that if it wants to be sustainable for many years to come, it's got to contribute significantly to open source. Because otherwise, the project it depends on will stagnate, and it won't be able to be sustainable. And I'm talking more than just a fly-by commit here and there. But the people and companies like the ones I mentioned actually make me incredibly happy and optimistic. But I think we should make it even more common to contribute to open source, either personally and as a business. But I know and I understand that the first steps in becoming an open source contributor can feel really daunting. I get that. I've been there. I think we also put prolific open source authors up on pedestals sometimes and think we can't be like them. But I think as Steve said, I too encourage you to kill your idols. You can do this, and your contributions will be valuable and impactful. So let's talk about some strategies for getting started, taking those first steps. For instance, what project or projects should you start contributing to? Well, I asked about how folks got started on Twitter, and I got some common responses. One of them is just fixing bugs and adding new features in gems they're already using in their applications. And I think this is a really good place to start, because you have a vested interest in these gems. You're already depending on them, and you're already at least familiar with their public APIs. It's also likely that if you depend on a gem, many others also do. So your impact will be magnified beyond how you're using the gem in your company or in your use case. You'll also end up helping people who are making the world a better place, like Aaron said. I encourage you to dive right into a code base. Just clone it down from GitHub and start looking around. But don't worry about trying to understand it all. Not even experienced folks normally can just look at a medium to large size code base and just intuit what's going on. Instead, I encourage you to take simple steps, like try to run the test suite. In fact, you'd be surprised at how many test suites in open source projects just either don't run or have a few failing tests, or they don't run unless you have a very specific setup, which the developer may or may not have documented. So developers often forget that the project setup is smooth only because they have a very specific setup on their laptop or their computer. And you're trying to run the test suite and getting it working or documenting those nuances or automating those nuances is a huge impactful thing to do. In fact, if you get the test suite running correctly and easily, you've made the barrier to entry for even more contributors much more likely to happen. Also, if the tests aren't currently running on a service like Travis CI, which is a continuous integration server that's free for open source, try to get it running and make a pull request with that. There are many projects that welcome contributors and will try to help you if you get stuck. I encourage you to seek out IRC channels or mailing lists. This tweet is from Andrew Hooker, who works with Spree, and they're doing it right. They're mentoring folks through their first pull request if they seek them out. So do seek out those projects where the current contributors will help you and guide you. Because I think many of you know open source software kind of has a stigma of being harsh to new contributors, telling them to RTFM or offering really unconstructive criticism of their code quality. But I actually haven't seen this nearly as much in Ruby, and I think we should keep it that way. And as you become more experienced, I encourage you to remember where you came from and seek to mentor folks and offer constructive advice. So a lot of open source projects in Ruby suffer from the open issue problem. They have a fair number of open issues, and there's little activity on them. And this is a really bad feedback cycle, because as the number of issues grows, it feels more and more daunting to start on any issue at all. You can help tremendously by attempting to clarify open issues and make them more actionable. So what this looks like is find an issue, find an open bug report, and try to reproduce it in the master branch of code. If you can't reproduce it, comment on the issue and say, hey, I can't reproduce this. It may have been already inadvertently fixed, and the issue can be closed. It may be duplicating another existing issue, and if you find that, comment on it, and it might be able to be closed. If you are able to reproduce the problem, try formalizing it by writing a failing test case and adding it to the gems test suite. In fact, if you just write a failing test case and make a pull request with that, even if you don't know how to fix the bug itself, that's a huge positive impact, and it will make a maintainer's day. Because honestly, in a maintainer's mind, everyone who's reporting a bug report should be writing a failing test case, except that doesn't happen nearly often enough. So by taking on that task, you're offloading a ton of work from maintainers, and you're already having a huge impact. You're also teaching other folks how to write better bug reports. So Richard from Heroku, who's over there, has created a web service called Code Triage. Yeah, let's actually clap for that. I'll tell you more why. So the idea behind this project is you can go there and find some projects that have a lot of open issues and sign up to receive an email once a day with a new issue that you help triage. So I actually had Code Triage on my slide deck before I met Richard or even knew who he was or that he was the creator of Code Triage. And he's here in RubyConf India with me, and that's very cool. So thanks again to Richard. So after you get involved with triaging things, it's kind of a slippery slope until you're just super involved with the gem, making feature requests and implementing features, doing bigger picture things. And in fact, I think if you start triaging issues, it's only a matter of time before you're invited to join the core team or the list of committers. In fact, I have evidence to support this, at least one, anyway. This is John Rowe. He signed up for Code Triage and got notified of an RSpec issue that had been open for over a year. And he commented and said simply, "Did this ever get done? Is this something that's wanted?" And Myron said, Myron, one of the maintainers, said, "No, it's actually not. We're not going to do this because we actually don't want to support this feature going forward because there are a lot of better ways to do this now that 1.9 and 2.0 are out." And so we closed the issue. And he says, "You can thank Code Triage." And so that was a slippery slope into him contributing into him adding features to RSpec, fixing bugs, making pull requests, and he's now on the RSpec core team. I encourage you to triage and bug squash as a team or do it with other people. If you're new to Git or new to pull requests or new to even Ruby in general, teaming up is a great way to learn because I think more than any other community I know of, Ruby folks love to teach other people. You have to put yourself out there a bit and ask. One method I've used lately is tweeting with the pair with me hashtag, and this has been popularized by Avdi Grimm in a recent talk. The idea is you tweet about something you want to pair on and tag it with pair with me, and it'll probably get retweeted, maybe even by Avdi, which would be awesome, by the way. And hopefully someone will respond and hook up with you. But to do this, you have to embrace remote pair programming, and I think you should, actually, because this is a great skill to have as well. Because it's likely that whomever responds to your pair with me may not be in your city, and that's OK. There are some really great resources on pairprogramwith.me to help with remote setups. So I personally think the best setup is a terminal editor like Vim or Emacs. It seems like Emacs is winning this conference. Did anyone else get that gist? I'm going to throw my hat into Vim, but whichever one you're more comfortable with, Vim or Emacs, I feel like tend to work the best. And then something like Tmux, which is a terminal emulator, and you can share a terminal session. And then something like Skype or Google Plus for audio or video chat. And all of this is on pairprogramwith.me as well. I've done this with about 5 folks since Avdi's talk, and I'm kind of hooked on it. I really especially like pairing with folks from other backgrounds, other countries, and I'm going to do this more after I fly back. So pair with me, please. You'll often hear that folks recommend contributing to documentation as a way to get started as well. I think writing good docs is actually really difficult and often requires like an expert level knowledge of the gem. That said, improving a getting started guide or touching up a README or API docs are a great way to get started. Because as Tony says in this tweet, developers who are more experienced often leave out a lot of knowledge because they even forget that they know it at all. And so you can have a great impact on an open source project actually by using your status as a newcomer to it to make the documentation better. I also encourage you to organize folks locally, like the presentation two presentations ago. Organize Hackfests, organize open source days, organize random hacks of kindness. I ran across Open Source Fridays from Dross Software, for instance. That's awesome that that's happening here, and I hope it happens more. Yeah, thanks, Josh. I saw the tweet on the bottom here after Aaron's talk this morning. That's awesome that that's happening. So just like most of us got to wherever we are in life by others' help, we didn't do everything by ourselves, we also build software with lots of help. When you contribute to open source, you're keeping our Ruby community sustainable. It's also very possible that you're having positive impacts well beyond what you can even know. Someone may be learning from your code that you push up, or take it and build something that makes the world a better place. I feel like we should realize that and figure out how you can contribute back to the commons. Open source is actually a really great ride for you personally in general. You're going to meet incredible people. You're going to improve your skill set. You're going to increase the visibility of you and your local community and India in general. You're going to pass along knowledge to others, and you're going to keep our community sustainable and passionate. So thank you so much, and I'd love to have a discussion about this. So does anyone have any questions or an experience they'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions.
Great.
Hey, thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
Three things. One small thing I started to just improve over a period of time. Usually whenever we find a bug with a gem, we just monkey patch it within our application.
Right.
And most of the times we forget about it.
Right.
So one of the habits I started to do was to just fork it and then put the code, even though you're not now monkey patching it, you're actually overwriting the code. Now as a fork for an existing project is available. Obviously you can do a pull request on it as a step. But as a habit, in some project which is not really being maintained on a regular basis, I look at the forks and see, does it have this feature? Does it have this fix? So it's the same effort. Rather than monkey patching it, just forking it and putting your code in there means you contributed your stuff into GitHub. It may be of some use to other people. Obviously, you can develop the habit of giving the pull request to it, but this takes the same effort, but still some sort of contribution. It's just easy for people to follow as opposed to monkey patching. Now, second thing is that this talk about contributing to one thing, but some people may not be able to contribute as in effort or code. But there are several developers who may be finding some small monetary contribution to be useful. So for those developers, some small amount of money can be contributed as a way to encourage them. Sustainability, right? Some people may be even, it's very difficult still these days that people can sustain out of the open source contribution. But I see many projects, when I look at it, donate in GitHub. Right. But you find it like a very small number, $40, $50. It's really, really depressing to see that. And it really doesn't cost a lot of money to do it. In $5, 100 people contribute is $500. And another great thing that I found recently, there's something called gettips.org or something like that, where instead of trying to just donate a big chunk of money, we could just contribute weekly $5 or whatever to. So you can just pick one project that you, like everybody distributes this, obviously now you're encouraging people. Just pick one project, maybe contribute $20 a month on a regular basis. That's going to be a great help. The third thing is that even though there's a Ruby conference, let's not forget the ecosystem underneath it. Many people use Linux Mint and other kind of stuff, which really runs on donations as well. Wikipedia. So contributing money, some small techniques like this to contribute as well is really less effort, but we can feel very comfortable that we're being part of this ecosystem as opposed to just taking it in. Thank you.
Those are all really great points. Thank you for mentioning all those. Yeah, I especially want to call out GetTip. I didn't mention it in my presentation, but GetTip is doing some really interesting things and just actually trying to kind of change the whole paradigm, honestly, of how open source kind of works in some ways. I encourage you to check out that site and think really hard about if that's a way that you want to give back by donating an amount of money to open source developers that are doing really great things. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I share your view about people not giving back to open source, not just Ruby, but generally open source around. But I think your numbers might be slightly skewed on the first month because we hire a lot of fresh graduates. Mm-hmm. And when we ask them to go study Rails, they go to Rails tutorials. And the first thing that they are taught there is to put all their projects on GitHub. Right. So when you search on GitHub, you will be, it's amazing to see that there are thousands of hello world, right, my first blog. So would those affect your numbers? I'm just looking at those numbers. It seems skewed, at least for the first quarter, because once they are done with the Rails tutorials, I don't think they're going to either keep it, maintain it, or anything. It's just lying there dormant for probably, years.
Yeah,
so I'm just thinking that could be a number that's skewing your statistics.
I think you're right. Yeah, I tried to mention that. I definitely think that a lot of people do push up code that they never intend to change, and that would skew that statistic a bit. You're right.
Eliminate forks from your number and get a picture. That may give
So that number did eliminate forks. Yeah. Yeah, it didn't count forks.
For example, this 34 I have, just to put the fix in there.
Right.
They're not going to be maintained on a regular basis, but they can only be fixed.
Correct. Yeah, I did leave out forks for sure. Yeah.
We do a consultancy project in Rails. So I have a question that, like I have done a couple of projects, and normally in the contract agreement, the agreements are like the code belongs to the client. So there is always a question that whether I have something important, how can I put it? I mean, we have done something important, but then how do we put it on the open? How do we make it open source?
Is the question
so
like your
how is it
client
handled
owns-
normally? Yeah, because if we are a consulting organization or software development organization, and we have done a consulting project, not our own product. So because of that, the code belongs to client totally. Not most of the times that's the agreement.
Well, it all depends on how the contract is written, and that's why I encourage you to in your contracts. For instance, at my company, in our contract we say, look, I mean it's all in legalese, but basically this is the TLDR. Look, we use a lot of open source software to build your things. You allow us to extract things and put it back into open source. It's only fair. It's only going to help us all in the long run. So we basically have contractual indications that we can extract open source from their applications, as long as it's not things like proprietary or really domain-specific stuff.
Okay, so do they get agree for it? I mean, so is it easy to convince them?
What now? I didn't get this.
So is it easy to convince the clients, right, for which we build a product that if we extract, we are going to extract something from the code and we are going to put it open source. So do normally companies get agreed for it?
Do I normally?
He's asking if the companies agree to such terms.
Yes, by and large, I mean, they have to if they want to work with us. I mean, we do turn down a little bit of work, but yeah, I mean, the way we put it to them is, we're building your application. Like I said, 98% of it is open source a lot of times, and so it's only fair that we contribute back. Yeah.
So, hi, Andy. Thanks
Hi.
for a lovely talk. Just a question about the data. You made an assertion that maybe, or you had the question, maybe we are just more busy. But I know everyone here is pushing private Ruby code onto GitHub. Like I do it every day, and I'm sure many of the people in this room do push like private Ruby code to GitHub every day. So does GitHub have any information on? Is it really true that we are more busy?
Is it true that?
We are busy. This is only public data, right? These
Right.
are only public repositories. So is there a lot of Ruby activity on the private repositories?
No, the busyness was just a hypothesis. I don't necessarily have a basis for it. Just anecdotally, I feel like of the Ruby developers I've talked to and have heard common reasons why they don't contribute to open source, it's because they're working so hard at work and then they want to go home and just forget about work or be with family or friends. And that's totally valid, which is why I think it's got to be part of your business to give back. I think some open source developers will do it in their personal time because they enjoy it, and that's great. But it shouldn't have to be a requirement necessarily, especially when you're basing your huge portion of your business on it.
Hey, Andy, what are your thoughts on, like Mike Perrin has Sidekick Pro, and
Right.
there's Fusion has Fusion Passenger Enterprise. They're all paid versions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't necessarily know exactly how I feel about those yet, but I think we're going to see more of them. I think we're also going to see more gems that are licensed either GPL or AGPL, and there's some
Subscribed
interest.
blogs, right? What, like, Railscast is now gone pro.
Okay, yeah,
You
right.
have,
I don't think it's invalid. Like it's always been valid under most of the permissive licenses, even GPL, to take code and modify it and then sell it. The GPL's restriction is that you have to provide the source if you distribute it, but it's always been fine to make money on open source. It's just kind of been like taboo. But if we're going to be sustainable, maybe that's a model that has to work. I don't necessarily have an opinion on it, but I think it's interesting, and it maybe reflects a little bit about like how those people feel like what they need to do to make it sustainable. But yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more like paid things, pro versions of open source software. I mean, a lot of companies already do this, right? Like Cloudera is one I can think of offhand. Like they have a Hadoop implementation, but then there's like a more pro version, or Or you see people do things like ops code most of their stuff is open source, but if you want a hosted Chef server, they'll host it for you. So you can host your own if you want. But I also do think we'll see a lot more GPL and AGPL, which means that even if you're taking it, modifying it for like a web service, you have to provide the source back to the community.
Interesting. I think we have a question there.
Sure.
So as a business owner who agrees to these contracts for hire, I would love to put some terms in there, like you said, that if you want to work with us, since we're doing a lot on open source, we'd love to give back. But I don't have the money to spend on a lawyer to do that, right? Are there any standard terms like that which you'd be willing to share with us, so we can actually start attempting putting those across in our contracts at least?
Oh, you mean could we share the language that we use?
Yeah, the legal language.
That's a great point. I'll try to put that up somewhere. I think that would be fine, but I'll check and I'll tweet about it or blog about it maybe actually. Yeah.
If I can copy paste it, that'll be.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think in most cases, your customers would probably never mind if you're using open source software to say that if there is a component which is not hampering your intellectual property, can we open source it? Just before open sourcing it, you can tell them this is what we've done. Have a look at it. They probably agree. All right, any more questions? All right, thanks a lot, Andy.
Thank you.